I'm Joe with iCoat. I'm going to be going through a couple of different samples today of different looks of white marble for your countertops. In preparation, what I've done is we've already got the sample boards made. They're coated with concrete, and then we primed them to be completely white using the iCoat white primer. And then I mixed up epoxy and of the countertop epoxy, and I added about 4 ounces of the white primer into the epoxy to make it a pure white. And I also added about a tablespoon of silver spur. That silver spur is, when mixed up in the epoxy and spread out, it gives the countertops a really nice shimmer and makes it look very natural. So I'm going to be doing 3 different looks that are fairly common that I get requests for. First one I'm going to do in the middle here is going to be my most popular by far. So basically what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to use some silver metallic spray paint. I'm not going to use a whole bunch, but I'm going to kind of mist over the top of it and make some slightly darker areas. When you use spray paint on an epoxy surface, what you're going to be doing next is agitating it and pushing the pigment, the coloring of the spray paint into the epoxy. Once that epoxy cures, that pigment's inside the epoxy and it's not up on the surface anymore. As the epoxy cures, everything settles down a little bit, so you don't have to worry about any of that stuff being on top anymore. It's all sealed up inside the epoxy. You'd have to sand all the way through this epoxy to get these colors out. They're inside the epoxy. It doesn't take a whole lot, so if your customer wants something that's really light, you can really just lightly mist it and it will show up eventually. Then you just take your chip brush and you want to establish some sort of a pattern. It'd be helpful if you looked at different patterns of granite and stuff like that on the internet and stuff, where you can kind of figure out what might look natural. But I'm just going to tap out a small pattern here, and then I'll just fill in the spots around there. And then once I do this, and I'm just kind of half pushing my chip brush into the epoxy, not totally mashing it down. Once I do this, then I'm going to add 2 small black veins. I always tell my customers they can choose to have as many black veins as they want, or absolutely none. It's totally up to them. So they get to create their own countertop. But to do the black veins, it's usually easiest, and you can be really precise, if you get your chip brush and it's fairly clean from epoxy, and just spray paint right on it. And you can put your black vein exactly where you want it. To draw out these lines, I usually just go back and forth inside the black that I put on there. Give them a little bit more of a crisp line. Add a little bit of overspray here. So get rid of that. That's from the black spray paint that I just put on my brush. This one we're going to make look a little bit more like Carrera marble. So what I've done is I took the same epoxy that I mixed up and had white in, and I added a small amount of black tar into the epoxy to give it a gray tone. Now you can increase or decrease the amount of stain that you put in there to give it the tone that your customer wants. Then what I do is I just get my brush wet here, and what I do is I kind of tap out a line in a couple of different patterns. And then what I'll do is I come back and I'll switch these patterns up a little bit to give them the veins that are typical of this type of marble. Of course, over a larger countertop, you can vary the patterns much more. It doesn't have to be so uniform, but with a sample board, we're really limited on the amount of space that we have. And then if you don't want these pure white spaces, you can clean up your brush pretty much, and then just go back in and tap out to where you have a little bit more of a natural gray fade in between the lines. So for this last one, we're going to do a larger vein of coloring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to again use the silver metallic spray paint, but I'm also going to use a gray metallic spray paint. The gray is a little bit darker than the silver, and I'm going to do a larger portion. You can do something similar if you were to, like I did previously with this gray, you could pour the veining in, but I just kind of like the way this looks. And again, I'm going to go over now with the dark gray. So I get a little bit of variation in gray colors, darker and lighter. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to agitate these just a little bit on the edges. And then what I'll do is I'm going to drag my brush across this to make these colors kind of run together. Depending on the size of the vein, you might need to use a smaller chip brush. It looks messy at first, but once it starts to settle down a little bit, it looks pretty cool. Usually, if you've got a vein that's coming up to your edges, you want to tap out the color on the edges as well to make it sure it looks nice and natural. And then again, I'm going to clean my brush up just a little bit. I usually do go ahead and tap around to give a little bit of a natural shading to it. Unless the customer is asking for like pure white areas, I would recommend that you do this. And you will just pick up some natural shading just from the pigment that's still sitting in your brush. So when you're torching the countertop, the wet epoxy, what you're actually doing is, first of all, you're heating up the epoxy, causing it to be more fluid and helping it to self-level. And the second thing you're doing is causing all the bubbles inside to release and come up to the surface sooner than they naturally would. So usually you end up torching your countertop at least twice, if not 3 times. Just depends on the countertop and the environment and everything else.